I want to say welcome everyone to Adasina's Q2 investor briefing. Just quickly, I'd like to introduce myself. Kikuhas, Aksanihas, Akadhas, Akishas, Chatlikat Wait Yakaini, Yashkanda Etz Yuchat Duasauk, Kanaktadi Yuchat Duasauk, Yech, Itzati, Kutisit Itzati, Dakloedi Dachkan, Jishkat Kwan. My name is Kevin O'Neill Smith. My Tlingit name is Yash Kanda Itz. I am Raven, Ganak Tadi, a member of the Kutisit in Klakwan, and a grandchild of the Dakloedi. I am also the impact strategist at Adasina Social Capital, and very, very happy to be here with you all. In this briefing, we're going to share key details about our new Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Rights investment screens, alongside our partners at First Peoples Worldwide and Inclusive Development International. But before that, I just wanted to cover some quick administrative items related to questions. After we have covered the items in our briefing agenda, we will respond to questions that have been submitted in advance and during the briefing. To submit questions during the briefing, I recommend utilizing the Q&A channel to submit those questions. For anyone not familiar with that channel, you can find the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen or wherever you have your Zoom menu bar located. Our backstage team will be coordinating questions for discussion during the Q&A session at the end. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to address all questions during the briefing, but please be rest assured that we will follow up with any unanswered questions and with full responses following the call. As it relates to the chat, please also feel free to engage with our team through the chat channel during the briefing. Keep an eye out for links that will be shared in real time to provide additional details and resources related to the topics that we'll discuss. And for security purposes, we are not going to be allowing anyone to share links that haven't been pre-screened. Before we dive into our amazing conversation that we're going to have today, I just want to quickly shout out Adasina's first impact report, which was published in April. The report celebrates milestones that we've achieved together from inception in 2020 all throughout 2023. And related to our topic today, the report highlights our impact and wins specific to our racial justice focus since releasing our racial justice investor dataset in 2020. You can read more about the report, which we'll link in the chat now. And more than that, the report also highlights the partners at the heart of our work, like First Peoples Worldwide and Inclusive Development International, who we are very grateful to have with us here today. The impact report will be available for download on our website, and I invite you to learn more about it and our work on racial, gender, economic, and climate justice. And all of those relevant links should be shared in the chat now. With that, I will pass the baton over to our Director of Social Justice Strategy, Renee Morgan, to get the ball rolling with this awesome conversation.
Hey everyone, I'm Renee Morgan, the Social Justice Director here at Adasina. If you've been to our briefings before, you've seen me, so I won't spend too much time on me. I'm really excited about today. Two of our partners are here, David and Kate, to talk about the screens, and it's really central to what we do here at Adasina is partner with folks working in the social justice realm and directly impacted and working directly with impacted communities. So I just want to name the two screens before we get started. So what we'll be talking about today is some of the data in our portfolio, and I may interchange the words data set and screen, and you may hear other people interchange those words. We mean the same thing. If I say data set, I mean screen. If I say screen, I mean data set. It's all the same thing. So we have an within our portfolio and available to everybody publicly is the Indigenous Peoples Rights Screen. And what that addresses specifically in the screen, and Kate's going to go into way more detail, so don't get lost in my words here, are companies expressing explicit cultural appropriation, companies violating Indigenous peoples' policies, lands, and rights and protections, or exhibiting a pattern of violent behavior towards Indigenous people, companies deploying capital that infringes on Indigenous land or desecrates sacred places. The local community rights screen is addressing companies that seize land and displace local communities from their land in violation of their land rights. So I said land a lot in those few sentences. And both of these screens address land sovereignty. And again, David and Kate are going to go into far more detail about that as to why, how, and why it's really vastly important. But we have those named differently, right? We have an Indigenous people screen and local community screen. And the reason is that those communities identify themselves in different ways. The definition is different based on the communities. It's different based on how it's recognized in different types of places across the world. We are going to talk about that at the end of the presentation as well. I just wanted to address it because you may say, well, why do you have two screens? Those sound exactly the same. They're not exactly the same in screening, but it's more importantly, they're not exact in the way that communities identify themselves. So that said, I am going to stop talking in a second, but I want to introduce Kate and David. So, I've been in the ESG field for a long time, about 25 years, and I've been at Adasina since the beginning, 4 years ago. And there's sort of a way that like you work with people so long you can't remember a time that you didn't know them. And Kate's kind of like that. Kate and I have been working together, I think probably since you were at First Peoples Worldwide. Um, so so Kate's work has been dedicated to building healthy Native communities through economic development and addressing violence against Indigenous women. She's an enrolled citizen of Osage Nation. And I just learned this today, which is interesting since I thought I knew a lot of things about you. Kate was the inaugural American Indian Law Program Fellow when she got her law degree at CU Boulder. I didn't know that. So fun things about my job. David, I met more recently, and David's a global advocate of land, housing, and natural resources rights, and spent the last 20 years supporting communities facing land grabs, forced displacement, and human rights violations. The thing I learned today about David, which I'm also like, I'd love to have this conversation at a different time, is David accompanied communities in Africa and Asia to negotiate reparation agreements with mining, agribusiness, and financial service companies, and advocated for human rights accountability at international financial institutions. So reparations from financial companies, vastly interesting. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate in just in a second. I just want to mention that we've been, like I said, we've been working with First Peoples Worldwide since the inception of Adasina. And I want to mention, because I always do on every meeting that I have, that capitalism in the US is based on violence. Capitalism in the US and wealth in the United States is based on a genocide, land theft, and slavery. And if we're not working to rectify that, if we're not working in capital to repair harm of where capital came from in its current state, then I personally don't believe we're doing our job. And it's the foundation of like why Adasina exists in thinking about capital through a justice lens. And so when we work, a lot of our work here at Adasina is centered on when we use the word BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we really want to center the experiences in the US of Black and Indigenous people. And so everything that we do, Kate's on our advisory board, their stewardship circle, everything that we do, we're at least thinking about and trying to incorporate Indigenous lens into the work we do. So that's why Kate is here. That's why we thought the Indigenous people screen was important. And with that said, I would love to hear way more from Kate.
Thank you for that kind intro, Renee. I appreciate it. And let me just say that I'm so glad to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation to the Stewardship Circle, Renee, and for all of our shared work. And thank you, Kevin, for moderating this briefing today. It's really my work has always been in Indian country as it's captioned in the United States and with Indigenous peoples. And so I get the privilege of having that laser focus at my desk and working at First Peoples Worldwide And it's wonderful to work in partnership with Adasina as they take the laser focus of so many different organizations and so many different issues and create a path forward for investors and a path forward for all of us. So it's my pleasure to be here. So I'm the executive director at First Peoples Worldwide, and our mission is to work from a foundation of Indigenous values to achieve a sustainable future for all. And we can move to the next slide. So what does that mean? What do we do? What we do day to day is to build bridges between Indigenous peoples and the private sector, and to build a business case for free, prior, and informed consent. So what does that look like as a data set? What does that mean? So the North Star for Indigenous peoples globally is self-determination and the ability to determine their own futures and to have exercise over their economic, social, cultural, political, and spiritual rights. And the way that we caption that in terms of data is where those rights are being furthered or where they are being stopped, where they are being harmed. And what does it look like in corporate practice to support Indigenous peoples through free, prior, and informed consent, through allowing free and fair participation and decision making as to Indigenous peoples, or where consent has not been achieved, where Indigenous peoples are not considered in development decisions or any decisions related to private sector, and where those companies have run roughshod over the rights of Indigenous peoples. So you'll see here the criteria that we've created. And let me say too that there are a number of different organizations that have implemented this kind of criteria over time. What we really focus on is the pattern and practice of whether a company is perpetuating a violation of the rights and protections of Indigenous peoples. And you'll see that broadly captioned, but also a pattern or practice of exploitative behavior towards Indigenous peoples. And this really keys in on that core right to consent, as captioned in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What we're looking at is there a pattern? Where is it that a company is continuing harm or perpetuating further harm? And one of the key aspects of work with Indigenous peoples and for Indigenous peoples is self-determination. So it is the right of Indigenous peoples to say yes to a project and yes to a company in terms of partnership, in terms of economic development. It's the right to negotiate, to say yes, but, yes, and, no, maybe, no, but, all of those different things, and to enter into a negotiation. And it's the right to say no. No, we do not care for this particular development. We do not care for this particular thing. And so the way that we screen for that is looking at patterns, because we know that with 6,000 different entities around the world, Indigenous peoples are making different decisions. What we really want is the private sector to ask. We want them to say, hey, is this the kind of development that you are seeking? And to respect that decision. So that's a big part of how we caption our screen. You'll see here that we have explicit cultural appropriation here as well. Examples of that in the United States include several years ago, one of the big fast fashion brands had a Navajo line of clothing, but they did not ask the Navajo Nation. It was not taken from Dene artists. It was simply used as a branding mechanism. There was no cultural respect involved in that at all. One that continues is you'll know the Jeep car, the Jeep brand Cherokee. The Cherokee Nation has said over and over again that they do not consent to having the name of their nation used as a brand. And yet that continues. So really screening out companies that have not considered the cultural rights and the linguistic rights of Indigenous peoples. There was a company a couple years ago that started to trade on a stock exchange using language, Cree language, without any connection to Cree culture, without any benefit to Cree people. And that was an engagement that we entered into. So those are kind of how we form our criteria. Those kind of issues gave us insight into how we create a data set. How do we make sure that we are captioning this correctly. And then we have here too, capital that infringes on Indigenous peoples' land rights, where they are held. And then also desecrates sacred spaces. And what I'll say here in terms of this criteria is that in many cases in the United States and outside of the United States, Indigenous peoples do not say where a sacred space is necessarily, but it is a conversation. And if if a tribe or a Native nation were to say, please do not go here, they're asking for respect. And that could very well be a sacred space. Now, there are many sacred spaces in the United States where Indigenous peoples have entered into negotiations about how to use that space and how not to. So you'll see here a strong theme in this criteria really is self-determination, allowing Indigenous peoples to voice their priorities and having those priorities respected. Next slide. So I just wanted to give a case study of the work that we do. A lot of my work is with shareholder advocacy and really bringing Indigenous leaders to shareholders and into the decision-making realm. We have worked with the Gwich'in Steering Committee for a number of years. The steering committee was formed in 1988 to protect sacred land. They have land in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's the coastal plain. It's at the very top of Alaska. That land is sacred to them as part of their creation story. It is a place where the caribou herds, which the Gwich'in follow, calve. That's where the caribou herds calve. And that place is sacred because it is the place where they do calve. And it actually is a really interesting spot of land because due to the winds off of the water, it's actually one of the few places that those calves can live when they're very young because there's no mosquitoes. So the calves are safe there, and it's recognized as an important place. The Gwich'in actually do not step foot in the coastal plain. So in 2017, the Tax Act mandated that there should be lease sales in that area. So we, First Peoples Worldwide, along with a number of different allies, launched a corporate campaign to protect that space, and were able to secure commitments from 28 banks and 20 insurance companies to protect that place for the Gwich'in. Number of different tactics that were used there, shareholder advocacy, investor letters, and really part of our work is to get Indigenous leaders into the room. So really traveling with and supporting the Gwich'in Steering Committee in those engagements. Next slide. So another aspect of our work is that we work and we are the secretariat for the Investors and Indigenous Peoples Working Group. It's a coalition of investors and Indigenous leaders that was formed in 2006, really focusing on shareholder advocacy and the ways that we can thread this information directly to companies and to shareholders. A number of different projects have taken place under the auspices of that group. And I really want to say too, like this is a group of investors. What we do at First Peoples Worldwide is to just put the priorities of Indigenous peoples in front of investors every month. It's the third Thursday of every month, 11 a.m. Eastern. It's an open call. But really, our job is to put the priorities of Indigenous peoples in front of investors. So as they're moving forward in their work with companies, they can bring Indigenous priorities into those conversations. We've had a number of different wins and different work, one of which being after a 20-year engagement in July of 2020, the Washington football team changed their name, which was a very huge win for a lot of different people, and namely a lot of the Native youth who now do not see that terrible name as they're just trying to watch football. And from that win, what we've seen in Indian country is that a number, I think in the hundreds of high schools have also changed their name, meaning that Native youth can play basketball and baseball and sports without their identity being an issue. So these things really ripple out in very positive ways for Native people around the US. All right, next slide. So I'll just cover very quickly a couple of the other resources that we have. As I said, our work really is to put put these priorities to investors, to build capacity for investors, and to build capacity for Indigenous leaders to participate together in these engagements. So we have an FPIC due diligence questionnaire, free, prior, and informed consent, that we give to investors and to companies to allow them to understand what does it mean to solicit consent? What does it mean to have that Indigenous peoples have collective rights? And the step forward, how? How does that happen? How do we operationalize that? We also do research, and one of our biggest pieces of research over the last couple of years was to look at the Dakota Access Pipeline case that took place a number of years ago that violated the rights of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and many others. Just very quickly, one of our biggest findings there was that, and of course, the tribe had said in 2014 that they wanted a reroute, that they didn't want the current route, and the route went through anyway. In 2016, there was a lot of social disruption, a lot of conflict, and oil started flowing in that pipeline in 2017. What we found in a case study is that from August of 2016 to September 2018, the company's stock declined in value almost 20%, whereas the S&P 500 increased by nearly 30%. So while we can't say necessarily it's exactly causal, what we can say is that there is a material impact when there's a failure to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, and there is in fact operational, legal, political, and social risk involved. And so finally, I'll just end this by saying that we are also involved with the SURGE Coalition, Securing Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the Green Economy. And that is a coalition focused on the urgent need to implement free, prior, and informed consent in the green economy. And really, we see this as an opportunity as there's so much transition in the world, in the green economy, economic movement, so much going on. This is the time to say that Indigenous solutions need to be at the table, and Indigenous voices and Indigenous leaders can be there. And in fact, Indigenous leaders have solutions. We have FPIC, we have ways of understanding corporate impacts and also changing corporate impacts to be beneficial for everyone. So that is a quick presentation of the work that we do, and I will turn it back over to you, Renee.
Thanks, Kate. Super appreciate all that information. I'm gonna keep us moving here. So David, I just met, I think it was been about 2 years ago, and under different circumstances. To tell you a little bit about who Adasina is we will take feedback. I met David through some feedback. David reached out in inclusive development, reached out to say, hey, you know, we think you're a good investment firm, but you are invested in a couple companies that don't meet our criteria, and perhaps you should look at that. And so look at that we did. And we took those companies out of our portfolio and further asked them if they would be willing to support us and help us figure out how to take their data and put in our portfolio, and then further give that to the world. So you all have access to all of the information that David and Inclusive Development International has worked on and given reports about, and most importantly, accentuates why land is a fundamental right and why people should have the right to decide what happens on their land. And it is, in fact, an issue of self-determination. So with that, David.
Thank you so much, Renee, and greetings to everyone on the call. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about our work and our collaboration with Adasina, and to share the platform with Kate, whose work with First Peoples Worldwide I have enormous admiration for. Let me start with just a quick background on Inclusive Development International. For those of you who don't know us, we support communities around the world to defend their land, livelihood, and human rights in the face of harmful investment projects like mines, plantations, power plants, pipelines. And our goals are to redress harm, to deter abuses, to incentivize business decisions that respect human rights and protect the environment by increasing the legal, reputational, and material cost of corporate abuse. In the simplest terms, we make companies pay for bad behavior. And the way we do that is by following the money, to identify all of the investors, lenders, insurance companies, buyers, and other actors who are profiting from harmful investment, so that we can understand where the pressure points are and communities can understand where the pressure points are. And then we support affected communities around the world who come to us requesting information about the projects and companies that are harming them and threatening their rights, to develop and implement multi-pronged advocacy strategies that really build leverage around those pressure points. So you could go to the next slide. Over the past 7 years, our team has investigated over 280 harmful projects in 36 countries, uncovering the involvement of more than a quarter of Fortune 500 companies and helping to identify and seize advocacy opportunities, hundreds of advocacy opportunities, alongside communities and grassroots human rights defenders. Cases like the Kampong Speu sugar plantation in Cambodia, which forcibly displaced over 1,100 families, small-scale farming families. We found that the project had been financed by ANZ Bank in Australia. And after uncovering that information, we supported the communities in a years-long campaign and complaints process against ANZ Bank. And that ultimately led the bank to agree to contribute the gross profit that it had earned from the loan directly to those displaced families. And that set an important human rights precedent for the banking sector. So last year, as Renee mentioned, we began sharing our data on the companies that we've investigated with Adasina, and that has helped to inform the local community rights screen. And we love this because it allows us to cut through all the greenwashing that characterizes so much of the ESG investing industry and share the experiences of communities whose rights have been abused by corporations directly with genuinely responsible investors, like many of the people on this call, to inform your investment decisions. Go to the next slide. So the number one harm or risk posed by those 280 plus projects that we've investigated is forced displacement, either economic displacement in the form of land grabbing and destruction of resource-based livelihoods, or physical displacement in the form of evictions from people's homes, and very often both. Forced displacement in the name of the development is among the most widespread serious human rights violations that we see in the modern era. It affects more than 15 million people every year. It's really a silent human rights crisis, which barely registers as a risk in the calculations of ESG ratings agencies. So I really applaud Adasina for working with us to help develop this screen. The UN human rights bodies have affirmed on numerous occasions that forced displacement constitutes a gross violation of human rights. It is inherently discriminatory. It targets the poorest and the most marginalized communities, and it has far-reaching impacts on a whole range of internationally recognized human rights. It really sets its victims back on the social and economic advancements that they've made throughout their lives, and it impacts their future and the future of their children and their grandchildren. It has unique ramifications for Indigenous peoples by trampling their rights to self-determination, as Kate discussed, but it also affects many communities that have land-based livelihoods, that have deep historical, cultural, and economic attachment to their land and their place, but don't self-identify as Indigenous and are not recognized as such by their governments. So I wanted to share one example with you of a community that we've been supporting in the West African country of Guinea, which was evicted at gunpoint. They were robbed of their land and their livelihoods by one of the world's largest gold mining companies. The community is based in Kintinian. It's a town of about 150,000 people who make their living directly or indirectly from artisanal mining, which their ancestors have been doing for over 800 years. But in the late 1990s, AngloGold Ashanti was granted a mining concession over an area about twice the size of New York City. And that included the town of Kintinian. Artisanal mining was subsequently banned in the area when this concession was granted, even though that's been the primary economic base of the population of this region literally for centuries. And that deal has been very lucrative for AngloGold Ashanti. Over the past decade, the company has extracted over $5 billion worth of gold from the concession. But in 2015, the company announced that the mine was depleted and that it needed to dig a new pit in another area. The only problem was that there were 380 families that were living in that area, and they said no to the plan because it didn't offer them any meaningful benefits, and they were worried about how that displacement would uproot and disrupt their lives. But instead of patiently negotiating acceptable resettlement terms with the community, the company instead gave the Guinean government an ultimatum. They said, make that land available to us within 3 months, or we're going to close down our operations in Guinea. And of course, the government heeded the message. First, they arrested 11 community negotiators. That was then followed by an influx of state security forces into the area, including the notorious Red Berets, who have a gruesome human rights record in Guinea. The residents described it as a hostage situation for the community. Security forces looted their businesses, they took their merchandise, they used tear gas in people's homes and beat the occupants. They set people's huts on fire, people were arrested and shot. This is Sira. She was walking home from school when she was shot in the back by the military, which had surrounded her village. And the bullet just missed her spine. It exited through her neck. She had to drop out of school because of that trauma, and she's lived in constant pain ever since. Now, the official reason for the presence of security forces in the area was purportedly to oust foreign gold miners. But everyone knew what the real reason was. It was to oust the community that lived and worked in the area that AngloGold wanted to dig their next pit. The company then turned up to conduct its resettlement inventory after this siege with armed soldiers by their side. And one by one, the residents were forced to participate and sign the inventory summary that was handed to them. Some were told if they didn't sign, they would die. And to others, like Basi, that message was obvious from the gun that was pointing at his head. And when I first visited the community at the resettlement site that they'd been moved to, what struck me most was there wasn't a single tree. In their old village, the families had mango and orchard and cashew orchards, which shaded their homes under the sweltering heat, and also provided them with income and food. But this new site that they were moved to was barren, lifeless, no water to allow people to plant gardens, and no gold in the ground or alternative livelihood opportunities for people to put food on the table. 3 months after the relocation, only one of 24 water taps that the company installed at the resettlement site was functioning. So the families had to buy water from private sellers at a very high price. And the toilets were all clogged because brilliantly, the company provided flush toilets, but didn't connect them to running water. And because there wasn't really any functioning water system at the site, the toilets didn't work. So people who couldn't afford to buy water to flush their toilets were forced to relieve themselves outside. The primary school that the company built never functioned because it failed to ensure that the state would provide teachers. And at a cost of about $4 a day round trip, most of these families who have just been displaced from their livelihoods couldn't afford to transport their kids back to their school in town, which they used to be able to walk to from their old homes. So most of the kids dropped out of school, which would affect them and their lives, the trajectory of their lives, for generations to come. So 380 families were forced off their land by the country's most feared military unit. They weren't allowed to say no or to negotiate. People who resisted were imprisoned and shot. Their homes were bulldozed. Their businesses were looted. They were relocated to a place with no water, no trees, no functioning school or clinic, no way to make a living. And yet, AngloGold Ashanti continues to rank third in the sector, the mining sector, on the community well-being indicator of the Responsible Mining Index. Now, what is wrong with that picture? I would say that it tells us that the ESG research and ratings industry is fundamentally broken. And that's why I'm really grateful that Adasina has created a platform like Bridge, which is informed directly by the experiences of communities that are impacted by publicly listed companies. Now, in this case, by following the money, we were able to help the community file a complaint to the World Bank's accountability mechanism because we found that the World Bank was indirectly backing the mine through a financial intermediary bank in South Africa. And we then engaged with AngloGold's major investors, and we were able to get several of them to engage, to use their leverage, to urge the company to provide redress to this community. And as a result of that pressure, we were able to get the company to the mediation table, and the community was able to, over the course of a couple of years, reach several agreements that have led to the water system being repaired at the resettlement site, the school and the health center being upgraded and staffed, and some remedial compensation being paid out. Mediations are still ongoing, and we are currently trying to reach a final agreement on compensation and livelihood rehabilitation. But investor pressure remains the key to this company and all companies we see acting in accordance with their stated human rights policies. So we usually tell investors who are exposed to companies like AngloGold Ashanti, you don't like their behavior, by all means, divest. Put them on a public exclusion list, please. But before you do that, engage with the company, use your leverage to try to improve human rights outcomes. Because time and again, we've found that when investors do that, when they use their leverage, especially when they do so collectively, that can be a really powerful force for change. Thanks.
Thanks so much, David. I just need a minute. I was like heavy, and thank you so much for bringing us stories from folks all over the world. I want to mention, I just want to close, and then we're going to go to questions. Actually, fortunately, I think we have a little more time than I expected us to have, so that's great. So I think I just want to point out that when we talk at the beginning of the presentation at the top of the hour, I said something about that justice investing, or thinking about investing, thinking about justice, sorry, is about repair. And certainly it's about that, because capital has done just an immense amount of harm, and it still continues to do harm. And I think that that's where our work starts. But I also want to mention that it is also the answer to the future. That, like, when we talk about impacted communities, this isn't about like feeling good or doing something like that's good. What we're really talking about, from a business case, because we are talking about capital markets, is that folks have been entirely left out of the system. In fact, we have exploited capital markets, and wealth building has exploited communities for hundreds of years, and continues to, as David so brilliantly pointed out and tragically pointed out. But those folks survive. They have the answers. Like David said, that community has been mining for 880 years. That the answers to sustainability, and the big words that we talk about in ESG, like sustainability, impact, and, you know, whatever words you use at your own firms. The answers actually already exist, and they exist in the communities that we aren't listening to. And so the whole idea about Adasina is bringing in the voices that have been most harmed to repair relationships, repair and make people whole in their exploitation, but also because they actually offer us the solutions to survival, that we really only have one planet. And if we continue to extract, kill, harm people, and we continue to extract and harm the planet, like none of us survive. Like Kate talks about free, prior, informed consent. It's not good for just one person. If it's good for the person that's most impacted and most left out of the system, it is good for everyone. Like these policies ultimately benefit us all. So that's what I mean by justice. That's what Adasina means by justice. It's not about feeling good about ourselves or thinking that your money is doing something like good. It's really about like survival for all of us and real like a more just world. So anyway, I wanted to say that because I was just like really moved by those slides. And that really is the basis of our theory of change. I do want to circle back because at the top of the hour, I also talked about the difference between local communities and Indigenous peoples' rights. And I know David and Kate both mentioned that. Kate, can you just can we like circle back to that and then we'll go to questions?
Yeah, happy to. So there is quite a difference in terms of rights conferred when you talk about Indigenous peoples and also local communities. So Indigenous peoples look at the standard for Indigenous peoples is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the international consensus on the minimum standards necessary for the protection of the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And under that, it recognizes individual rights that are, you know, collected from all the human rights instruments, but also the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, because so often, due to the colonial project, the governance systems that guided Indigenous peoples for generations were decimated, often quite intentionally. And so the UN Declaration looks at the collective rights of Indigenous peoples to make their own governance decisions in all of the different buckets, economically, culturally, socially, to, for instance, retain their children in community, to not have children sent to boarding schools, to be able as a community to make decisions. And so there are collective rights that differentiate Indigenous peoples from local communities in many places around the world. And so there is a difference there. There's a self-identification as Indigenous component when we're talking about Indigenous people self-identifying. There's that historic continuity to the land, and then distinct social, cultural, and economic differences and you know, practices that would differentiate Indigenous peoples from the local communities. So there are differences. And also, one thing that I think is really important here is that our look is to put in, as David said so eloquently, investor pressure to respect human rights. And in fact, many of the issues that are distinct for local communities and Indigenous peoples are the same. So where corporations can implement respect for free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, they can do so with local communities. And those concerns are often very, very similar. And so our look, while there is a distinction, what we are really pushing for is a private sector that is respectful of all of the communities on the ground, of those in place locations and all of the people there. So the distinction is important, but it is also just important that the private sector respect those human rights and respect the local communities in all of those ways.
Thanks, Kate. So one of the ways that we work at Adasina is to, I think we've gathered, is partner with people that are bringing the voices of impacted communities to the rest of us and leverage capital markets in service to social justice movements and justice. So we do make all of that information public. So please, it's on our website. The comms team will put in the links. If you want information about both of these screens, if you want to see which companies are on them, the website, and then David mentioned Bridge, and I think it's in the, I know it's in the chat as well.
Just to recap, really encourage everyone to stay up to date with all of our work. Sign up for as many newsletters and mailing lists as you can. Join the working groups that Kate and Renee would have liked to probably have talked about if we had more time. But all of that information will be available in a concise, consolidated follow-up. And just a huge thank you to our social justice partners, David and Kate, for joining us today for this briefing. And join us again for our Q3 webinar coming in, or sorry, briefing coming in September. And yeah, everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you again for your attendance. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.